North Korea doesn't partake in a lot of events that the rest of the world does, so the wrestling world was in shock to discover that in April of 1995, WCW and New Japan Pro Wrestling were going to join forces to present a pay-per-view in the country. Not only was this going to be the first time a North American wrestling company stepped foot into North Korea, but it would also become the biggest wrestling pay-per-view in the history of the sport, with an attendance of almost 200,000 people, a record still held to this day. Wrestlers and other staff representing WCW consisted of Ric Flair, Scott Norton, Road Warrior Hawk, the Steiner Brothers, Chris Benoit, Eric Bischoff, and more. Also along for the trip was boxing legend Muhammad Ali. Flair has stated that he accepted the trip as Bischoff personally asked him to go, but he wasn't really excited to travel to North Korea as there were so many unknowns about the country. Sonny Ono, who also made the trip, was told by the Japanese embassy not to go, and that it was dangerous for Japanese citizens to enter the country due to kidnappings. Other wrestlers, including Scott Norton, noted that they were a little nervous but were also a little naive about the state of North Korea, only knowing that it was a communist country. After landing, everybody's passports were taken from them, at which point Ric Flair wondered if they would ever make it out of North Korea. The wrestlers were required to wear suits and ties anytime that they weren't either in their hotel rooms or performing. This was a requirement by the government and was strictly enforced. One morning, Eric Bischoff, who was at the time very into fitness, decided to go out running. Upon returning, he was scolded for his decision and told that they could not leave the hotel or there would be severe consequences. To make matters worse, Too Cold Scorpio and Hawk ended up getting into a fistfight after words were exchanged, causing confusion amongst the locals. Another incident involved a phone call between Scott Norton and his wife. After she accused him of making the trip just to party and have a good time, Norton replied by telling her how horrible the country was. After a few minutes, North Korean military officials showed up at Norton's hotel room yelling at him for insulting their country. They took Norton to an undisclosed location where they intimidated the wrestler and told him that he is not to say one more bad thing about North Korea. Norton has gone on record to say he thought he was a dead man at that point. On the way to the event, Flair and Norton spotted the enormous crowd and commented how they were impressed that they could draw like that. The driver asked what that meant, at which point they explained the wrestling term to him. He replied that people were forced to attend whether they want to or not, and defying the requirement would result in death. Once the actual show started, the wrestlers experienced something that they had never really experienced before, an almost dead silent crowd. All of these people in attendance, and barely anybody made a sound, making the trip even more uncomfortable for the guys. Finally, during the main event, which was Flair vs. Inoki, the fans started to react, specifically to Inoki, which they seemed to like, which is funny since they didn't know who he was. Most in attendance didn't even know what professional wrestling was, but by the last match, they were into it. The next morning, the wrestlers were anxious to leave the country and get back home. After arriving at the airport, there were still concerns about their passports, as the guys didn't receive them until they were boarding the plane. Even in the air, wrestlers were still nervous and didn't breathe a sigh of relief until the plane touched down in Japan, at which point Ric Flair stepped off the plane and kissed the ground. This event is not widely known, never really talked about, and one of the few WCW pay-per-views that does not exist on the WWE network. Even during the time it was happening, it was rarely talked about. I remember hearing Bischoff mention the trip on an episode of Nitro shortly after his return, but really it was one of those events that was kind of just swept under the rug. It was a huge accomplishment for not only pro wrestling, but for America as well.